those who've stuck with us. Thank you for those who are just joining the fun. Melissa O'Sullivan with the Danube Institute. We welcome you here today and always. This third panel is called The Global Outlook for Inflation, Growth, and Debt in a Post-COVID, Post-Sanctions World. And you see the speakers up. The moderator is John Prout, and in many ways, John has been the intellectual genius behind this program. And so I thank you very much, John. To his right is Alberto Mingardi, the great economist with the Bruno Leoni think tank in Milano, Italy. Thank you for scheduling us around your many duties to include he's got to rush back to teach a class this evening. So thank you, Alberto, dear friend. John Fund will be joining us by Zoom. John, hopefully, will be coming in shortly. And a longtime friend and journalist, and he knows everything there is to know about any of the elections going on in the U.S. So we'll look forward to his remarks. And Michael Anton, who has just arrived from the United States. And thank you for making heroic efforts to get off the plane, go to the Hilton to check in, not being able to check in because your room isn't ready, and coming over here. So thank you very much for that extra effort, Michael. And finally, we have Craig Biddle, who is editor of the Objective Standard, and you see his full bio there on the screen. And without further ado, the program is yours, John Prout.
Could we put that next slide? While we're waiting. So 2 years ago, we were where? We were all pretty much locked down in our apartments or houses and desperate to figure out what was going to go on in the world. And then when we were able to liberate ourselves, we had a fervor to spend. And that's exactly what we did with the help, at least in the US, of $5 trillion of government support. Anton's looking up now what it was in Europe, but I believe it was 2 trillion euros. But in any case, we spent, and GDP was up 10% in the United States in 2021. The Fed also continued accommodative monetary policy, as did the European Central Bank and other central banks around the globe. And not surprisingly, when you have pent-up consumer demand, huge injection of government support, and accommodative policy on the monetary front, guess what? Last month, we reported 8.5% inflation indicated by the CPI in the United States. Germany last week, producer price index was up 30.9%. Some of it obviously has to do with the food and energy price hikes due to the Ukrainian-Russian war. But we are now in a situation where we've also added to our debt approximately $40 to $50 trillion of additional government and private sector debt, so that we are now, behind me, 303, hopefully, $303 trillion worth of debt globally, with a rough 350% of global GDP as far as the debt to GDP ratio is concerned. Now, that's pretty much all the numbers you're going to hear, so let's relax and not get too concerned about the math that we're all going to have to, that we won't have to deal with. But we do have to deal with how we're going to pay this debt off. We do have a couple of specialists here from Washington, D.C. who will tell us whether Congress will kick the can down the road and do nothing, or whether it's possible to come up with some solution. Because of this, last time I quote a number, of this 303 trillion, 60 trillion, or divided by 5, $60 trillion has to be refinanced every single year. And for the first time, we have this level of debt with interest rates going up in the majority of the Western world. So that means higher interest expense. Where are we going to get all this money? How is it going to be financed? And if it isn't, what's the outlook? Dan Mitchell, to my right, will be going through a PowerPoint 7-page where he will show what one possible outcome will be due to one of the key components, which is demographics. We'll also try to discuss, along with other people, some of the items that you see here in your booklet, food and the dollar as weapons, inequality gaps, the dollar as a reserve currency, its future, stagflation, deflation, et cetera. So I'd like to turn it over to Dan to start the first part of what will be a bit of a depressing panel, I'm afraid. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to really be a depressing person today because I'm going to show you some numbers that deal with the sustainability of the welfare state. This is not my, someone, I assume, who's in charge of PowerPoint can put my presentation on. There we go, debt and demographics. And I'm going to start with this population pyramid, because this population pyramid shows what Western societies used to look like in terms of their age profile. There would be a small number of old people in our societies, a big cohort of working age people, and then those working age people were having plenty of children. And what that meant was a reasonably sized welfare state was fiscally sustainable. It wasn't something I would like, but the math would work on it, so long as in these pay-as-you-go systems, you always need to have a bigger generation of future taxpayers to make these things work. But let's look at what's happened in the United States over time. This shows the actual real numbers of what the U.S. population profile looks like to date, along with projections of what it's going to look like in the future. And you can see that instead of a population pyramid, it's sort of becoming a population cylinder. In other words, why does this matter? Because if you don't have enough young people becoming working taxpayers, and you have more and more older people who are expecting government benefits, this whole thing tends to break apart and blow up. Now, every bit of gray hair I've gotten has brought me closer to being a senior citizen. So I don't want all of us to be put on ice floes or something like that, but how do you make these numbers work? And I want to show you some data that's going to show that it's not just the US. Let's look at Hungary in the year 2050. That's not a pyramid, or if it's a pyramid, it's almost an upside down pyramid. Those are grim numbers. Now, I know Hungary has a very aggressive plan to try to encourage more fertility. I'll be very curious if there's an expert here on that topic to tell me whether that's working, because in most countries, efforts to boost fertility have not been very effective. So US numbers, Hungarian numbers. Now let's look at some numbers for the European Union as a whole. The lighter colored numbers are where we are now, or at least where we were in 2019. The darker colored numbers are where European countries are going to be in the year 2070. As you can see, there's not much of a population pyramid now, and there's going to be even less of one in the future. Now think of what this means. You already have extraordinarily onerous fiscal burdens in Europe, where in some countries the burden of government spending is consuming more than 50% of economic output. And of course, you have very extortionary tax burdens in those countries as well. To what extent will it even be possible for these countries to try to extract more money from their productive sectors with additional taxation? And then if you can't tax the money, and at some point you might not be able to borrow the money because credit markets are going to look and they're going to say, wait, you might be Greece, you might not have the ability to pay back. What's the only alternative? That's where politicians turn to the figurative printing press. So it's a very depressing outlook. So this is population by age groups. Let's now look at data, and I hope the numbers are big enough to see on the screen, but we're looking at the economic old age dependency ratio here. And the important thing is you can see where we are, 46% in the Eurozone area, 44.7% in the EU as a whole. You get by 2045, 68 and 67%. By 2070, 71 and 72%. That's a horrifying change. Actually, let me rephrase that. There's nothing wrong with people voluntarily choosing to have fewer children. And there's certainly nothing wrong with people living longer. And again, I appreciate that concept nowadays. But when you have a welfare state based on pay-as-you-go, tax and transfer, these numbers should horrify us. And are the countries in Europe, are they adopting funded pension systems? To some extent, there are a few countries like Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, they have partially funded pension systems. They are making some reforms. Some countries are increasing their eligibility ages for when you can get a government pension. But I think a lot of this is too little, too late, and certainly not enough to compensate for these numbers here. Let's also look at the total economic dependency ratio. This is the number of working age people compared to everyone else in society that those working age people support. Now, by the way, these numbers are too optimistic, because just because someone is working age doesn't mean that they're working, and it doesn't mean that they're working in a private sector job. A lot of countries have a very bloated government workforce, and those people obviously are not net contributors to the overall fiscal situation. So what you really would need, and of course the European Commission would never publish this kind of data, what you really need is a ratio of private sector workers to everyone else in society. And if you had those numbers, and we would be much worse now, we'd be much worse in 2045, and we'd be much, much worse in 2070. And again, ask yourself the fundamental question. As this additional spending burdens and spending pressure continues in these various countries, how much more can they tax? Just as a practical matter, without driving away jobs, without driving away investment, without driving away entrepreneurs, how much more can they tax? And then that leads to the second question, how much more can they borrow? Especially if the European Central Bank doesn't have this ability to do sort of a soft core version of modern monetary theory. I mean, right now, I think Italy would already be in a fiscal crisis like Greece if it wasn't for the European Central Bank, but almost every European country's heading down that same path. And that brings us back to the original question. If you wind up having governments through central banks try to finance this with the printing press, then you get the kind of, the horrible 1970s stagflation would seem like a picnic compared to where we might be heading without a lot of structural reform in these economies. If anybody wants to get in touch with me to get this data, I'm always happy to share it because we really need to wake a lot more people up about the threats that all of our societies face. Obviously, the European Commission data doesn't include the United States. We're only 10 or 15 years behind Europe. We also face a serious crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. I think we're going to have a lot of follow-up questions on that, but we're going to have Alberto go next to give the European viewpoint. But I do want to come back on some of the comments that you've mentioned regarding the ECB and how it supported Greece and Italy. Mario Draghi had a famous quote, I think, what was it, a couple of weeks ago, regarding the sanctions. He said, "Do you want peace or do you want air conditioning?" And while...
Apparently, we've chosen peace over here.
Yeah. As opposed to peace or pasta, I think, Alberto. But we do have... It is a serious issue because war is never anything to joke about. And at the end of this panel, if we don't have any kind of optimism on the economic front, Craig Biddle has promised that we will have some optimism from him. But meanwhile, let's first go to Alberto, who give us his European view on a variety of topics, the energy laws. And I do think, based on what we were talking about last night, he was explaining to me about the bureaucracy element. particularly in Italy, but in Europe. And when we heard in the energy panel the discussions about, well, we just have to build some LNG terminals, build some pipelines, I think we underestimate the impact that the Green parties in Europe have done in terms of how they have not only put in legislation, but also regulatory statutes that make it difficult for the manufacturers to build a pipeline or to install it or get the permits, as well as the banks who are afraid of going against the regulatory environment and not being able to get their money back or getting payments delayed and so forth. So I pass you on to Alberto.
Thank you very much, John. On this point, I would say, of course. I mean, whenever we're talking about energy, we have a tendency of talking like it was just states making decisions and, being dependent or this or that country. But if it actually is companies that are buying gas from Russia, it's also because we made everything we could to make it impossible for them to drill the Adriatic Sea. And henceforth, their choices were economical in the sense they were the efficient choices available to them in that context of constraint. But I'd like to give very briefly some comments on what Dan just said. And in particular, I would like to play to you an unlikely role, which is the following. I'm a messenger from the future. And I'm a messenger from the future because we were talking about debt. And of course, Italy debt to GDP ratio this year is over 150%. Now, as they say, a single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is statistics. And I'm afraid something like that happens when we're talking about the humongous numbers of public and private debt all over the world. So let's put it this way. On my Institute website, we do have a debt counter that basically gives you a sense of how fast public debt is spiraling in Italy right now. John took something like 2 minutes to introduce us, a little bit more. According to our debt counter, in the same amount of time, our own public debt grew by 425,000 euros, which is basically, the price of a small apartment in Milan. When it comes to population, Italy is a very peculiar case. If you take the Italian population in 2014 and the Italian population in 2020, the Italian population actually decreased by 1,088 people. It doesn't seem a lot, but basically it's the second time it happens in history. The first time in which the Italian population decreased net was between 1916 and 1918, and I think you know why. For the last 11 years, we have a reduction of births, and from the last 6 years, we had a diminishing population. So, in a sense, I think Italy looks frighteningly like the future of many other countries in Europe when it comes to its debt and when it comes to its population. Now, this clearly begs the question that Dan has asked. With an aging, sometimes with a decreasing population and a generous welfare state, how can you make the math? And the answer is you cannot. But it's not a problem. Because recently we discovered a wonderful thing. You may remember the famous point by Margaret Thatcher that socialism ends when you run out of other people's money. But if the other people whose money you can take actually include the sons and daughters of your neighboring states, things change. What happened with COVID-19 was that we saw another leap forward in European unification. We have this idea in Europe that basically Europe is bound to become an ever closer union, crisis after crisis. And COVID-19 allowed for the development of a system of transfer that consists of both loans and transfer period. I mean, Italy, interestingly enough, has been the only country so far taking both loans and grants. Most of the other net beneficiaries of Next Generation Europe typically took only grants. And the consequences of that are interesting and tumultuous in the near future. There are already people asking for the equivalent of Next Generation EU for the Ukrainian war. The Italian Minister of Healthcare, Mr. Speranza, the other day said, it's going to be no problem with the consequence of the war because we'll simply have another Next Generation EU. We'll have another recovery fund. So the dynamics which is going on in Italy for sure, and I suspect also in other Southern European states, is that we're going to be safe with the money of our neighbors. Now, you see very easily that it's not going to be something that helps the European Union in solving its problems. It's not going to be something that helps the European Union to loosen the internal tensions, but possibly, it's going to be a matter of increasing frictions and disagreements, sharply dividing the European member states, not between, as some people in the South like to see it, some more free market or libertarian states that aren't there, but simply between social democracies that think about their deficits and social democracies that don't.
So, Alberto, tell me what is going to be the future of what you guys decided in the Maastricht Treaty, which says no more than 3% deficit every year and no larger than 60% debt to GDP, which was, of course, suspended for COVID. Are we ever going to see it, or is that a pipe dream? Because then I think it directly relates to the question of what about the U.S., which I will get to after your answer.
Well, Prime Minister Mario Draghi and President Macron actually wrote an op-ed in the Financial Times a couple of months ago. And broadly speaking, some member states are working to propose an update of the fiscal rules. Interestingly enough, in the Macron-Draghi op-ed, you can read the following sentence, which is, I quote, "Prior to the pandemic, the EU existing fiscal rules were already in need of reform. They are too obscure and excessively complex. They constrain the action of governments during crisis and overburden monetary policy. They also failed to provide incentive for prioritizing key public spending for the future and for our sovereignty, including public investment." End of quote. This is a staggering quote coming from somebody who was president of the ECB and was being actually the main person behind, the change of the fiscal compact during the 2011 euro crisis. My sense is that Italy, if the interest of Italy is in losing European fiscal rule, which I think is the opposite of the truth. I think the real interest of Italy would be in tightening European fiscal rules and being forced to do reforms. But if the interest of the country is in loosening European fiscal rule, we made a pot faux, basically because we went there too early, proposing our own version of the new rules. Then a negotiation process will start. Germany and clearly the Netherlands will wait in with a very different proposal than ours. I mean, the German finance minister has said a number of times that we need to go back to the old fiscal rules. I suppose that Macron will try to basically broker an agreement, positioning France, whose public debt, is too big for being one of a virtuous country, but is too small for being one of a truly vicious country. So it will try to position France as the country brokering an agreement, something in between the two different positions.
Michael, what's your thinking, and Dan as well, and John Fund, if we have him in Washington, about, I mean, we've made many attempts in the past decade or so of putting in a debt ceiling legislation. What's your thinking about the need for it, the realistically, being realistic about it's what kind of package could pass or won't pass, etc.?
I mean, unfortunately, the debt ceiling is a complete joke. It's the only time you ever hear about it is when they vote to override it. So it gets put on there. It's like, you know, putting a lock on your refrigerator and you have the key in your pocket. Anytime you get hungry, you just unlock it and eat something, but you somehow feel better because the lock is there. So they say they won't spend more than X. They dig a big hole, and we have a crisis. This now seems to happen at least once, maybe twice a year. They have a crisis. It comes down to this game of chicken between the Democrats and the Republicans. Sometimes we shut down the government over it. In the end, the debt ceiling is always raised. It's always overridden. A new ceiling is set, and we replay the game 6 months later. I mean, I don't know how closely the people here follow U.S. politics, but if you do, you will have seen this movie over and over and over, and you will see it many more times in the days, weeks, and months to come.
It is the same movie over and over again, but sometimes there are twists to it. We did get the Graham-Rudman-Hollings budget reform as a result of a debt ceiling fight in 1985, and that was indirectly pretty good. In 2011, we got some spending caps on discretionary spending, not on entitlements, which is the big problem, but at least some spending caps in 2011 as a part of a debt ceiling fight. But Congress then subsequently voted to override them at least 4 different times. They're still on the books. They're still a law, but they're not obeyed. And that's the fundamental problem. What you really need is not a debt or deficit cap. You need a spending cap, because spending is the underlying problem. Debt and deficits are simply a symptom of that problem. And the role model that we should all look to, I think, is Switzerland. Switzerland has something called the debt brake, but operationally, it's really a spending cap. And ever since voters put it in 2001 with an 84.7% referendum vote, ever since then, annual spending increases have averaged 2%, 2.1% a year in Switzerland. Now, if your government spending on average is growing 2.1% a year, even with a weak economy, your nominal GDP and your nominal tax revenue is going to grow faster. And so under the Maastricht criteria in the EU, debt keeps going up, up, up. Ever since Switzerland adopted the debt brake, the spending cap, debt has gone down, down, down. So if you care about real world evidence, the spending cap that they have in Switzerland is the right approach, but voters did it, not the politicians. And, you know our crowd in Washington, Michael. I mean, are they going to voluntarily put handcuffs on themselves? Maybe if there's a crisis. But I think we're just as likely, if there's a crisis, politicians will just use that as an excuse to put in a value-added tax or something like that.
What kind of crisis would you need?
It would be some sort of a huge stock market correction or something like that. We had that in 1987. I think it was called Black Friday, but my memory might be wrong on that. But the
Monday.
Democrats in Congress used that as a tool to bully Reagan into a tax increase. So if there is a crisis, the politicians almost certainly will say, this is the financial markets asking us to be responsible, but they define responsible as grabbing more money from the private sector. So maybe if we have the right people in charge, maybe there's a 5% chance we'll get something like a real spending cap. But in reality, if there's a crisis, I fear that will just be the excuse that politicians use to do something really bad.
I guess I have 2 somewhat depressing reality checks to that. Maybe they're reality checks, maybe they aren't. I'm happy to be refuted. Number one is, and this will terribly shock the sophisticated European audience, but virtually everyone who runs the United States government in Washington is unserious and an idiot, and will not do the things that are required that we're talking about. The second problem we have is that Americans are not Swiss. It's impossible for me to imagine America not merely voting 84% for a spending cap, but even 50+1% for spending caps. There's an old political joke that goes something like, if you're George Gallup, and you poll Americans, would you like X good thing for your country? 75% will say yes. It'll be 74.2 yes, and whatever the remainder is, 24.8 no. Question 2, are you willing to do the necessary means to get good thing asked about in question 1? 74.2 say no. The remainder say yes. So if you say, if we cap spending, we could avoid the fiscal cliff and we could have all these great things. This will poll very, very well, right? Well, capping spending means that you're going to be cuts or slowdowns in the rate of growth of these popular programs and this and this and this. And then they all say, wait, no, can't have it. So the politicians are a problem too, but they are in a non-trivial respect doing what they're supposed to do or what the system is designed to do. And that is to say they're reflecting public opinion when they refuse to make difficult choices and refuse to put serious constraints on things that people say that they want.
John Fund, you want to respond or follow up?
Okay, thank you. I'm never one to say that pessimists are wrong about what happens in Washington, D.C. Let me just present a possible counter-narrative. I think that we're entering next year a period of time that will very much resemble years 3 and 4 of the Obama administration, but with even some better prospects for good policy. What I'm saying is that the 2010 tax revolt, which was a precursor to the Trump rebellion of 2016, brought in a Republican House, but still a Democratic Senate. Even that was able to give Republicans in the Senate enough leverage to extend the Bush tax cuts and also, as Dan Mitchell indicated, have some brakes on spending and debt. They were abandoned or ignored in future years, but they can be revived. What's the situation that will happen next year is this. It is almost certain the Republicans will take back the House of Representatives. It is fairly certain they will have a majority in the Senate. And it is also basically predetermined that the Biden administration is going to be one of the weakest in history in its year 3 and 4. I don't have to go into the cognitive weakness of President Biden or the incompetence of his staff led by the master of disaster, Chief of Staff Ron Klain, or any of the other factors that make the Biden administration one of the most hapless in history. I will just say that the leverage that Republicans can exercise and also be joined by people like Senator Joe Manchin and Senator Kristen Sinema, who stopped Biden's Build Back Better bill and now want to also exercise leverage on the Biden White House. I think there is a chance, I wouldn't say 5%, I would say 20% chance that there can be an extension of the Trump tax cuts, which are set to expire sometime in 2026, and perhaps a revival of the debt and spending limits that Dan Mitchell mentioned. The Biden administration is going to be uniquely weak in years 3 and 4, and far more so than they were under Obama, and there was progress under Obama.
So if we're going to be in a weak situation in years 3 and 4, even despite a change in control in the House or the Senate, you're implying that basically nothing can get passed?
No, I'm saying the Biden administration is going to be extremely weak. We can stop the bleeding to some extent, the bleeding that your previous speakers mentioned. We can also, as part of negotiation over the budget, as happened in 2011 and 2012, force the Biden administration into some spending restraint. And in addition, remember, we're going to be in a recession. The Fed, look, let's be honest. The Fed has raised interest rates in order to counteract excessive printing of money many times. They have always tried for a soft landing. They have succeeded 10% of the time. Now, their interest rates, they're going to have to start kicking them up. The chances of them avoiding a recession are about 10%. So we're going to be in a recessionary mood that will have some impact and pressure for more spending, yes. But Biden has shown a remarkable weakness to get spending programs through even the Democratic Congress. So I believe next year, if the Republicans are in charge of Congress and the Biden administration is as weak as I think they can be, I think there can be some real leverage to get good policy. Again, I say the odds are 20%, but that's better than they've been in a long time. And the Biden administration is ironically one of our greatest gifts because it's so weak and hapless.
Dan, could you describe your Swiss debt brake the mechanism? Because I'm not familiar with it.
The Swiss debt brake has a 5-year formula where the government basically estimates what the projected trend line is for revenue, and that then determines how much government can spend, and it's worked fairly well. Now, one thing that's going to be very interesting, there is an emergency opt-out, and they used it for some degree during the coronavirus. That emergency opt-out then requires a clawback in subsequent years. So it will be, I'm going to be very curious to see whether Swiss politicians actually follow through and impose extra fiscal constraint in the upcoming years to make up for what they spent during the pandemic. As I already mentioned, in 2011, that spending cap we did in the US was just on discretionary spending, which is only about 25% of the budget. I actually don't disagree with John. I think there is a 20% or more chance for something small like that. But when I was talking about a 5% chance, I was talking about something really big and profound, like constitutional reform through a spending cap that applies to the entire budget. And that would be much more challenging. And by the way, on spending caps, I'll also mention Hong Kong has something like that in their basic law, which is what they call their constitution. Whether China allows that to continue, who knows? And also, the state of Colorado has something called TABOR, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. It's actually a spending cap in the U.S. Environment, and that's very simple. It simply says that government spending can't grow faster than inflation plus population, which might be an even better way of structuring it in the U.S. because people will understand it much better than some 5-year formula that they have in the Swiss debt brake.
Well, you had referred to the stock market crash as one possible event that could get the American public behind. I personally don't agree because basically the top 10% in the U.S. own 90% of financial assets. So if we're trying to get the country behind it, you got to respect the inequality gap that we have. I think we're seeing it, beginning to see it is in mortgages, which are now at 5% and probably will go up substantially higher, which brings back if you remember in a couple of decades ago, we were talking about bond vigilantes. That basically at some point, because the debt was so high, funny that we say that now, the bond vigilantes were going to come in and the U.S. Treasury would have to pay an enormous coupon in order to keep financing its debt. Somehow, we don't hear talk about that, but the bond market is still alive. The worrying thing about the bond market today, or this week, this month, is that bonds are rallying, indicating that in the long end, they believe we're going into a recession. So if the bond market is, which typically as far as those professional investors, institutional investors use that as a barometer of what is expected in the real economy longer term, that's a recession, which suggests that the Federal Reserve's hiking is going to break something, and then we're going to be in a recession. Do you have any thoughts as to whether the bond vigilantes are the solution, in which case we're quite a way away from it if we're entering a recession?
I'll make 2 points. I think bond vigilantes are still out there, but for a number of years, they've been overwhelmed by just central banks providing so much liquidity that you have sort of supply and demand factors keeping interest rates down. And I think the Fed now, Powell and the rest, just thought inflation was somehow a thing of the past. And obviously, it turns out that they're wrong on that. And then I guess the second point, I'm of the Austrian school of economics. And Austrians, if you were to summarize what they believe, it's that if you have an artificial boom, you're going to have a bust. One follows the other. And so, yes, I agree with John. I agree with you. I guess I'm agreeing with all the Johns. I think we have some economic bumpiness ahead of us. Now, having said that, don't forget, economists have predicted correctly 9 out of the past 5 recessions. So we don't exactly have a great track record.
Michael?
I'm no expert on these kinds of markets. I will say though that what I do expect to see is, and this is not also a new thing, is conflict between an administration and the Federal Reserve. We've seen this before. It's happened many times in my lifetime. Going all the way, I mean, I'm sure it happened before this, but I can remember George H.W. Bush in the early 90s complaining about Alan Greenspan and saying that the Fed cost him the 92 election, in part, also Ross Perot, and there were other things. But now the Biden administration hasn't yet begun to complain, but I think we can expect them to complain no matter what the Fed decides to do. If the Fed decides to hike interest rates to get inflation under control, then the Biden administration will blame the Fed for slowing down the economy going into an election year and creating a recession and tanking its popularity. If the Fed doesn't do anything about inflation, then the Biden administration will probably add the Fed to its enemies list. Publicly, it'll be, instead of the Putin price, well, not instead of, but in addition to the Putin price hike, it'll be the Powell price hike because the Fed botched this and it's not our fault. They're going to need, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, especially since much more fundamentally than